actually, to introduce the next panel discussion. Up next is our Diversity and Inclusion panel. The panel provides incredible insight and perspective to how D&I is being integrated into the industry and is invaluable to hear the stories of each individual person. In order to maximize our talk time, I'm going to introduce each speaker one by one, so please hold your applause until everybody is up on the stage. So first we have Lynn Powaleski. The speaker is the VP of Global Regulatory Affairs for Baxter Healthcare. She's a member of the R&D Senior Leadership and Quality Senior Leadership teams. Lynn also serves as the sponsor for the Activating Change Today Marketplace workstream as part of Baxter's ACT initiative to advance racial justice. Joining Lynn on stage is Mignon Early. Mignon is the VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Fresenius Medical Care. She has more than 25 years of experience in the nephrology industry and has held numerous leadership roles, including Regional Vice President, Group Vice President, General Manager, and Vice President of Clinical Quality. Mignon holds a master's degree in nursing from Drexel University and has been a registered nurse for more than 30 years. She believes that as a nurse, her perspective of diversity, equity, and inclusion always puts the patient first, and that the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a campaign or initiative, but a lived experience that must be part of a forever journey, both personally and professionally. Our next presenter joins us from Medline Industries. Jasmine Williams-McCoy is the Senior Director of Inclusion and Diversity for Medline Industries, a global medical supply company based out of Illinois. Jasmine leads all DE&I efforts, including building out the DEI strategies for all U.S. offices and serving as consultant for international DEI needs. In her previous role as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Rocket Companies, she led all DEI efforts and shaped the framework for Rocket Companies' version of employee resource groups. Our next speaker is coming from Zimmer Biomet. Willard McLeod is the third is currently Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Zimmer Biomet. He's a member of Zimmer Biomet's global HR leadership team and is responsible for developing and executing ZB's global enterprise-wide strategies for DEI, embedding its principles in talent acquisition, talent management, leadership development, and culture. He's also responsible for leading Zimmer Biomet's environmental, social, and governance efforts. Since joining Zimmer Biomet, Willard has spearheaded building manager capabilities around being more inclusive via an on-demand learning around DEI for all team members called Empower Every Voice. And finally, please welcome to the stage our last panelist, Marissa Chu. Marissa is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Integra Life Sciences. She has responsibility for the development and implementation of Integra's global diversity and inclusion strategy. Prior to joining the med tech company, she led the inclusion and diversity efforts for Gilead Sciences' commercial and corporate functions. She was also responsible for launching a company-wide sponsorship program to accelerate the development of key diverse talent and lead a team of business partners in the creation of functional diversity action plans. This is an amazing panel, and we are looking forward to your contribution. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Get settled in here. All right, well, we're going to kick off our first question. We have some names assigned to some later questions, but this first one we're all going to work on together. Why does diversity and inclusion matter in the medical devices industry? Who wants to go first?
I guess I'll go first. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. For those who are not familiar with our company, we had one of my colleagues speak earlier. This is Fresenius Medical Care North America, and we are one of the nation's leading providers of kidney care products and services. So as specialists and experts in DE&I and for our respective companies, it's critical that we are constantly thinking about the end users of our services and our products, to say. So when I think about the full life cycle of a patient and employees, we want to make sure that any device, that all patients have access to it. For those of you who heard Dr. Solomon earlier today talk about health equity, that is the true key connection for the medical device industry. Thinking about your products, your services, where and how patients can access them, as well as in those underserved markets, what can we do differently so that all patients have access to those services and products.
We'll just go down the line.
Sure.
Jasmine Williams, McCoy. I think there's kind of two buckets. It is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. A lot of people lean into the right thing to do, tugs at your heartstrings, but we know that in the medical field, anybody who is not part of the majority tends to have a difficult time when going to the doctor, addressing any medical needs. That would be women, that would be people of color, that would be people whose English isn't their first language. LGBT specifically, our trans and non-binary patients all struggle with going to the doctor, feeling heard, feeling seen, and actually getting the needs met that they need. And then you also have the side of like access to jobs. So that's the right thing to do. But the smart thing to do, which is what I usually say when I'm talking to companies, because kind of equals dollars and cents, is that the workforce and the world is changing. So very soon the people leading the companies and the work that's being done will not be cis white men who were born in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. We know that generationally, there's a lot of changes. Even if you want to ignore everything else, the generations are changing, their expectations are changing, the workforce is changing, the demands are changing, and you will be left behind if you are not keeping up with what's going on in the space of diversity and inclusion. And then I'll just add in the last part of people are demanding, our clients and customers are demanding that the work be done. If you're familiar with ESG, environmental social governance, or CSR is what it used to be called, corporate social responsibility, that's kind of where it's living. It's no longer just we do it because we want people to think we do the right thing. Now it's a business imperative.
So, I think Mignon and Jasmine hit a couple of kind of key components, whether you're talking about patients, you're talking about kind of some of the internal things that happen. I'll toss in that I think if we think about how are we trying to address sort of some issues from the past, systemic racism, how do we build wealth in communities? If you look at the next sort of 50 years of growth, I can tell you technology, medical technology, financial services, healthcare, those are going to be in the top 5 areas for growth. And so being able to participate in that growth and having the opportunity to sort of build generational and family and community wealth with access to opportunities is another reason why I think we want to be focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion inside of the broader medical technology umbrella. Because again, I think it gives us a chance to work on some structural wrongs that we are trying to correct and work in this area. You've heard diversity and inclusion, but there's also equity that's in everyone's sort of a title, I think, here. And I think the med tech industry itself is ripe, and as we've seen the last 2 years, is positioned for enormous growth. And so communities being able to take advantage of that growth is an opportunity that we can't miss.
Well, I mean, I would be able to echo what you all said, but for me, I mean, Willer and I were talking even before this. Years ago when I started, I came from the entertainment industry, and we used to look at, how many moviegoers are diverse. How many people watching certain television programs or getting magazine subscriptions? I think, to Mignon's point, like the patients that we serve are diverse. I think when you look at it too, if you're not focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion in your companies, then you're having a really narrow patient view. And I look at all of the, for the reason that I, joined first pharmaceutical or biotech and then came to Integra is I really want to be at a mission-driven company. I want to better the health of everyone. And I think many of us can probably say that, but think of what the unmet medical needs that we're not meeting by not looking, ensuring that our population is diverse in our employees and also that we're not serving patient population. I mean, I look at, certain diseases or maternal health. Black women are disproportionately, either dying or affected by postpartum health related incidences. And if we're not even focusing as an industry on that population, then we're not meeting the medical needs of folks, right? So I think it's not only, yes, it makes from a business and dollars, dollars and cents, but it is also the right thing to do, but also like the reason that we're in this industry is to help people to meet their medical needs. And so that's for me why it's so important.
Thanks. I'll just add to that, at Baxter, certainly we talk about the focus on the patients and the diversity of the patients and patients who are underrepresented and overrepresented in certain of our populations or treatments, certainly in kidney care. It's a big issue. And one of the things we identified as we started our Activating Change Today, racial injustice focus, is how do we bring more healthcare providers through the system? So how do we bring more Black healthcare providers into the system specifically so that patients can see themselves reflected in their physicians? We talk about internally how it's so important that our employees see leaders who look like themselves and things like that. But we identified an issue that, really, how do we get out to some of these historically Black colleges and universities and start funding? How do we help young Black students, apply to medical school? How do we ensure that they're taking some of the right classes? And so we've been trying to really do some things to pull through, because we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, but quite frankly, when we go to find Black experts in certain areas and stuff like that, it's tough. And so, that's an area we've been looking to try and focus on. Okay. So I kind of answered a little bit of the next question here, but as it relates to Baxter. But how does your organization build diversity and inclusion into its structure? So Mignon, I'll start with you.
So we've taken a real hard look at ourselves in terms of understanding our patient population. I'll start there, and our employees. Really taking focus on how do we ensure we are culturally competent to be able to deliver and have our patients feel comfortable, our employees feel safe, welcome, celebrated, and cherished. And so a lot of our focus has been around building trust and inclusion into our structure. We began this with our leadership. I'm sure many of you, we talk about tone at the top. So we started there, and we weren't experts. We actually hired consultants to help us to navigate this journey. But when we began with trust and inclusion, it became very evident where we needed to look at processes, policies, and really focus on what do we have systematically that is disadvantaging those marginalized groups.
Willard.
Sure. So at Zimmer Biomet, we started with a strategy, so very similar to Mignon. We began about 2 years ago. I'm the company's first sort of diversity officer. New leadership team, a lot of energy at Zimmer Biomet about how we were going to move forward as a company. And the thought there was that strategy would then drive actions to help support our mission and what we were trying to do as a company out in the market. So our DE&I strategy is pillared across a focus on team members, a focus on patients, communities, and then our partners. So we use that as a means of kind of understanding where we want to focus in DE&I, and you turn up the volume on each of those pillars over time. At Zimmer Biomet, I think being a med tech innovator, the notion of decoupling sort of innovation from DE&I, you can't do it. Those are coupled together, and leading in that space, we knew that we wanted to make sure we had a workforce, team members from a lot of different communities and backgrounds and ways of thinking to help drive our company forward. So having that strategy and then driving that strategy forward so that team members feel like they're engaged, making sure that their managers are inclusive and building cultural competency and inclusive capabilities so that those leaders are able to get the best from that talent that we're working so hard to bring into the organization is a key focus. And so all of those things help you sort of drive the organization forward, supporting both its mission, but also its idea about creating an environment where everybody can come and be successful.
Everybody can be their authentic self, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Their best selves.
Their best
I like to
selves.
say, yeah.
And a sense of belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. What are some misconceptions about diversity and inclusion work? So I'll ask Jasmine to start and then Marissa, but everybody may want to jump in too, but.
The first thing that comes to my mind is that diversity inclusion work is celebrations, events, maybe the extent of some mentorship. I think what people are used to are the visible things. It makes me think of in 2020, and I was still doing diversity inclusion work, what you saw a lot of companies do, right? They made some donations, they gave Juneteenth off, and they made a statement. Very visible things, but if you think about it, everything just ends there. After I've done those things, and everyone's like, yay, you did it, I don't have to do anything else. The real work of diversity and inclusion takes so much time and it's not as visible. And I say that just to temper people because sometimes it'll feel like nothing's being done. I've heard that from employees, I've heard that from leaders, nothing's being done because they want to see things. They want to be able to attend an event and said 100 people came to this event, but when you're measuring it, that does nothing. That event did not change anything, just like a statement doesn't change anything. But what does change things is putting together a strategy and really digging into data and connecting those dots and challenging the system, and which is the other thing people don't like. Folks who work in D&I don't come in to kind of get along and play nice. You do a little of that, but ultimately, we're gonna challenge a lot of the ways that things are being done. So I like the question just to temper people when they're starting into that journey, that this isn't gonna be, a Black History Month event and Juneteenth is off, and that, and we started a mentorship program and D&I is done. It's gonna be really asking very hard questions about decisions that are made, policies, procedures, lack thereof, and implementing things that don't seem like they're related to diversity and inclusion. I'm talking about performance evaluations, interviews, even, the structure of the building, because we're talking about accessibility. Those are things that people are like, why are you digging into this? But that's the work.
I think that's great. We didn't get here overnight, and it takes a commitment, and it's a long haul. It can't be a one-time celebrated thing or a one-time donation to something. It actually requires commitment. All right, Marissa.
Well, I think Jasmine said it so well, but I mean, the big misconception that most people have is it is performative. Is it a PR move? Isn't this something that just like our PR team or marketing should do? And it's like, no, you're bringing me in here as a practitioner. I am going to, it's really a change management exercise. I want to change behavior. I want to change behavior from, yes, performance management reviews, to just even how people think about giving out visible projects, not even a job or a promotion, just how they kind of dole those out. And it's very, very hard, and you can step on toes. So I will say that if you're thinking, diversity is just kind of like a feel-good thing, we're gonna have it's kumbaya around the fire. No, you're gonna have very hard conversations. It's gonna take a while. And we all said it, it is, I'm not in this business, and I know we aren't in it, because it is, yes, it's the right thing to do, but it is also really good for a company. Like, you can innovate, you can be a better company, you can be a successful company, you can make more money with diversity and inclusion, right? If you really if you commit to it and make the change. And so I think that sometimes people think it is a little bit more performative and we throw some money around and say some great things, but it's actually doing the hard work.
And can I throw in one more thing? I would say that there's expertise attached to that. So what I've seen happen a lot is that a company or a business area will select a random individual contributor who's really passionate and put them in charge of diversity and inclusion. And it tends to be focused on whatever they're very passionate about or their own identity. And something I say all the time is, if I came to you and said, I really love building computers. I took a class when I was in high school, built my own computer. Can you put me in charge of technology? You probably wouldn't. You would ask for me to have a little bit more expertise in the business and to be able to show that I can build out a technology team and not just build a computer. So I just want to add that one little thing.
And I'll piggyback onto that in terms of DE&I is not just a department. It is owned by everyone in an organization. And oftentimes you'll find, well, can't your folks do that? Well, we can be the disruptor, but the work is owned by everyone. We talk about performative, looking at performance reviews and looking to see if there are processes that systematically marginalize one group or disadvantage a group. A DEI practitioner, can point it out, but it's the partnership with your talent management, your talent acquisition teams that really move the needle. So I oftentimes you'll find that a company will put a team together and say, okay, here's your small budget, go make it happen. But it takes us all, truly the village.
Yeah, I mean, because it's every employee, every manager, because where it happens is not even the core group of people, right? But every manager has to live it.
Yeah. What I would add, and I think, to Jasmine's point, I think one of the things to be mindful too is I think there are a lot of different paths into this type of leadership, and we all do it differently. I do believe it is an expertise. I believe now you're seeing practitioners who've spent good chunks of their careers building capability to actually lead these functions. I will tell you, I came out of the operating line side. So I ran plants and operations and was a P&L leader. So I approached the work through understanding, how do we look at this? What are we benchmarking? Where is our strategy? What are our KPIs? How are we delivering? But what I've learned so much, I think the almost 10 years now I've spent in that space, is it's more than that. You're getting to know people's individual stories, their journeys, and how that shows up in that corporate construct. And how do you make that environment one where everybody, again, as I like to say, can come and be successful? And that's the real work, because it doesn't happen naturally. And so I think that's a really important point to understand. I assume passion is a table stake in this. There's a lot of skill that goes into actually creating this work and creating it successfully for organizations. And you're seeing, I think, a lot of that here with the backgrounds that we all bring into the work.
Thank you. All right, this next one's for Willard and I. How do you define diversity and inclusion in an ever-changing work environment?
And so it's interesting. I've led inclusion and diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You've seen diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging has shown up. There's now accessibility that's becoming part of the dialogue. So whatever you choose in that space, whatever letters you're choosing.
Justice.
Justice.
Justice, Jedi.
And I think that's what makes the space dynamic, and you get that from those of us who work in it. I think whatever is important is you have to have some definition. You can choose what your organization wants to focus on. So first, when I started this work, it was about inclusion. Very global company that I was working for, and they wanted to bring people in at that time. They had already been on a journey for many years in DE&I, or diversity and inclusion at the time, and decided that we want to focus on inclusion because we thought our colleagues in EMEA, our colleagues in APAC, our colleagues around the world might lean into that construct differently than hearing diversity, because people hear that differently depending on where they sit and their own lived experience. What does that mean for me? So again, I think it's important to start having definitions, however you want to define that in your organization, in a way that people are able to sort of lean into that work. So again, and they continue to evolve as we learn more, as we continue to sort of encounter inequity and lack of access for certain communities. And, again, even generational changes, I think that were noted earlier. All of that comes into creating those cultures and creating those companies where people, again, are able to come and help drive it forward. And so it's evolving, and it will continue to evolve. And it's not a destination. This is something that will continue to change. And that's what I love about it. So someone say, well, when is it over? It's never going to be over. No. And you have to appreciate and understand that. Yeah.
We were talking at lunch, and it's all through the lens at which you look at it, right? And your lens is different if you're on the ground in the United States. Absolutely. Or you're on the ground in Australia and places, and it's different in the UK than it is. And so it's being able to pivot and change that lens. One of the things, I'll go back to our activating change today. DE&I has always been an important focus at Baxter, but our CEO really took the moment after George Floyd was murdered and stuff like that to really focus on this fighting racial injustice piece and really use that as a catalyst to really push the organization's focus, like enough is enough, and we're going to focus on this, and it's about fighting racism, ending marginalization, and advancing social justice for everybody. And so it's being able to be agile, right, and to pivot and change that lens depending on what's going on in the environment.
Absolutely.
All right. How do you ensure inclusion programs are not focused solely on gender diversity and leadership issues? And that is Jasmine. Oh. Yeah, sorry. He's like, oh, my next thing is to Jasmine and
Okay.
Marissa. But again, anybody.
Yeah, we can all go that.
Let's see. I think there's so many layers to this. The first thing is, and I want to throw this out here because I noticed this prior to working with the international company, you'll see a lot of focus because a lot of other countries only track gender. Mm-hmm. So that's just something that took me a long time to find out, like, oh, okay. The other half of that, though, is I think, and I'm just being completely transparent because I don't know how to not be transparent. I think, one, when we say women, it tends to actually mean white women because I've brought up diversity inclusion data and saying we're focused on this with people of color, and I will always get the question, what about women? There are women who are people of color. Mm-hmm. So we're not leaving that group out. And two, I think there's a comfort level with the people who are in charge with white women because they look like their mothers and daughters and sisters, and they want to see them succeed. So I think really the first thing is challenging that. Challenging why do we want to start with women outside of the fact that we know that that's the only number, the thing that's tracked internationally, and thinking about other entry places that are a little bit more open. And what do we want to achieve with working specifically with women? What are we looking to address and change? What are the real problems? Because one of the other things I see is that those answers come from the men leading the conversation and not from the women who have the issues. So you'll find there's a lot of answers about sponsorship and glass ceiling. And what women will be saying is that work-life balance, equal pay, sexual harassment, these are very different conversations. And oftentimes you'll find that the issues that we're trying to address with women are issues for everyone. But I think ultimately it's an easy entrance point, which is a little gray for me because I always think, it's better to do something than nothing. But I also don't want to just sit there in that something for the next 5 years. Because what I'm seeing also is those numbers are equaling out, but we're still focused on that same group. How do we move that group forward, right? While also focusing on the things that people don't want to talk about, which is race and sexual orientation, honestly. Those are two things people aren't comfortable with. Maybe start with ability. Maybe start with, socioeconomic status, which means starting with your frontline workers. Start someplace else. Because there's other ways to do things to be innovative than to just start with women. I don't know who else had it.
Marissa.
No, I mean, it's, again, I
Next
feel like
time you go
saying
first.
You're saying everything, saying it much more eloquently than I would too. But I think people do think, one, if I have a global company or if I'm at a global company, we track gender across the company. So, and usually, if you look at the whole company, it's around 50%. Now, it gets more narrow, 50% women, so therefore we can do something. We can make those changes. We can help to increase the pipeline and get more women into senior management. And the exact same thing, I'll sit and, I've been in a number of companies. If you do a program like that for women, what you generally see is you will make changes in leadership. You will see more women. But really look at it because it is mostly white women that are getting. And it's not to say that there shouldn't be any white women in leadership, but if that's who's being positively impacted, then you're doing a disservice to all the other women in the company. And so some of the conversations I'll have will be, if you want to ensure that you're not just focusing on gender and it's not disproportionately positively impacting, let's say, white women, when I've had this with executives, we want to do like a senior leadership program, some development thing specifically for senior women to get them ready for, let's say, VP ranks. Well, when I look, Marissa, the director, executive director, I'm only pulling there's only like 1 or 2 Black women, a Latina, then maybe you're not focused on the right area. So I think that's what I would say of how do you ensure that you're not just sticking with gender and you're solving a problem, but you're not solving the problem. You need to look at where your data is and see where is it broken. Because if you fix, let's say, get some more white women into senior management, and people do, they focus on leadership, they're not focusing then on the longer term pipeline. So again, we're reiterating kind of what we said earlier. It is a longer term play, diversity and inclusion. And I think to ensure that you're not just focused on gender or leadership and forgetting about, sexual orientation, gender identity, race and ethnicity, that you actually have to have those hard conversations with your senior leaders and say, let's take a look at what we've been doing so far and is it actually having the impact that we want it to have?
So, and I'll piggyback on that. In our company, we're based out of Germany, and so there's German Work Council law around women in leadership. And so how we addressed this to make sure that it didn't stop there was we leveraged our employee resource groups, quite frankly. And the commitment for our diversity, equity, and inclusion work has been a commitment to grassroots, meaning we want to do what our employees tell us. And so we created many vehicles for listening to employees. And what we came back with was very clear that while we recognize the importance of women moving up into top management levels, but if we didn't address it from race and ethnicity here in the US, our employees would think we were tone deaf, I mean, quite frankly. And so it became not either or, but and. So don't look at just women, it's women and those who are ethnically diverse. And that, I think, has brought the power to it because it was grassroots from employees. So
and double click on Mignon and Jasmine, something that the construct that each one of my colleagues here highlighted was disaggregate your data. Okay, so the importance of data depend on where you are in the world and how you say that, is really important to understanding the problem you're trying to solve.
Yes.
And often and again, as someone who has managed and worked in organizations that had very mature DE&I programs, and again, had very strong programs around gender, when you're trying to kind of understand where your opportunities there, by disaggregating that data, you get to see where the problems are and have conversations about that in a way that starts to make that effort more inclusive, because no one is saying not to focus on women. That's not what's being said. But make sure that we're being inclusive of all women, veterans, women with different abilities, LGBTQ. There are a lot of women who are looking for opportunities to grow. And so when you have strategies that are focused on gender, don't forget everybody else, but disaggregate that data and you'll start to see other patterns. And you'll start to gain other insights that are really critical to driving your DE&I work forward.
Yeah, because in the term is intersectionality, when you have multiple, and everyone has multiple identities, but when you're talking about women of color, for instance, that's a very specific experience. So when you're building a program for women, this is the other thing I see, the conversation is targeted to a very specific woman, not just a white woman, but a married white woman with children in a certain part of her career. So everyone else in the room is like, this isn't really helpful for me. There's certain things that the advice given I can't do as a Black woman because it'll be received differently. So that's why it's important to know those nuances so that you can create a program that addresses all of them and not just this one little group of women.
And that's where you can leverage your BRGs, your ERGs,
Absolutely.
and make sure those voices come through.
to Willard's point, if you don't have a real data strategy, this work is triple the difficulty. You have to let the data give you information and insights that will inform your actions. And that, I mean, in most organizations, if you're going to go to top leadership, it's the data. And oftentimes you'll be surprised at what you think it is and what actually is there. I'll give you an example. In our organization, you didn't need data to see that the higher up in the organization you went, the more male, the more white it became. But what was interesting is we would hear, you're not bringing me the right candidates. You're not bringing me candidates. I don't have a diverse slate. So when we looked at our data, and it was aggregate in terms of you looked at representation of the organization and applications and the representation of those who apply. When we had great diversity, it was pretty there was quite a bit of parity between the applicants and the representation of the organization. But when those applicants moved from a talent recruiter interview, it was pretty close. But where you started to see it systematically change was when the recruiter hired or handed off the application to the hiring manager. So then you have much more information to say, this is a double click. What do we need to understand? And so from the hiring manager through to hire, people of color and women systematically went down from application to hire. So those are those data points that inform you in terms of where you need to take action. So I know you mentioned Baxter went out to the HBCUs. Well, we do that, but that was not the problem. That's not where the issue was. So was it decision bias? We don't know. But those are where you put your efforts and your resources so that you can begin to impact change.
And the other piece is that you can go to the HBCU, get a great talent,
Absolutely.
but if they come in and it's not an inclusive environment, they don't see the opportunities, they don't see people who look like them and are like them above, it's disenfranchising. You lose the engagement and you'll lose the talent.
Absolutely.
So you can have the great up front, but if you don't have the middle right, it's challenging.
And understanding your turnover.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're going to move to Q&A from the audience. So I think there's a microphone, hopefully.
It's on the way.
Hi, my name is Jessica Bendel. I work at Cook Biotech. We have a mentorship program for young professionals that come through our company, and I'm just wondering what would be the best way to make D&I a more active part of that mentorship program. So it's not just about career advice, but how we can incorporate D&I as well.
Is there an application process or just anyone can join?
It's open to anybody. Specifically, the mentees are targeted towards our interns and early full-time engineers.
Do you have employee resource groups?
She's just going to go there.
Yes.
Because just while we're getting the answer, I mean, there's a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
So Cook Biotech is 250 people. We do not have the resource groups. Cook Medical is much larger. They do, but they're decentralized from our employees who are at West Lafayette, Indiana, of course. So kind of, but not on site, if that helps. And I'm not speaking for her. I've just been there so much longer, and I could tell she was not sure. So I'll hand it back.
So is it about the diversity of the actual members of the Young Professional Network? Is it about who's being paired through the mentorship program?
Mostly, how can our mentors basically, pass down the ideas of diversity and inclusion to these people who are just entering the workforce. Some of them are still in college and are maybe thinking about what types of companies they want to join once they graduate.
So I have to believe your group has some level of focus around what are its agendas? What are the subjects that you all talk about when you gather and get together? And I mean, I'm sure any of us can give you probably 10 different books or 10 different discussion topics, but that's how you sort of build curiosity about the space. You know, you create, and I'm a strong and personal believer in, you have to create a space where people can make some mistakes in their conversations and dialogues and learning when you're doing DE&I work, but you have to find a place to start the conversation. You know, there's a lot of work, all of us, I'm sure, have worked in the courageous conversation space and creating, again, opportunities for people to learn about a subject that they may not know a lot about. You know, they may have grown up in a world where they weren't engaging with a lot of people who were different than themselves. And so you all can actually lead that. It's not something you have to go looking for. You can actually decide, I'm going to lead and create this subject and discussion in partnership with, hopefully, if you have it, other DE&I professionals or DE&I or HR people in your organization, because they can help make sure that you guide it the right way and create and give you some other ideas about how to do that. But step into it. Don't be afraid of it.
One of the suggestions I would give is, you talked about, geographic diversity and, between in the two cities in Indiana where you're kind of focused. But yeah, you're only 250 people and you're far away from Bloomington, but figure out how to tap into Bloomington. Figure out how you guys can join the different employee resource groups or whatever, right? We're all working virtually for the last 2 years, so there's got to be those opportunities. So I would say reach out. Worst thing, they're not going to tell you no. They're going to tell you how to get access.
Absolutely.
And I'll throw in finally, one is, and this might sound like oversimplified, but making sure that the mentors are aware of how D&I works at the company, what the initiatives are, because half the time that's the issue. You'll have managers or leaders who vaguely know that there's something happening, but can't provide any resource because they don't really know. And then the other thing is, if you can't have an ERG or a BRG, a diversity council or diversity business council. That's usually what I recommend for smaller sites, and maybe having it a requirement that, then I know you don't control this program, but have a requirement that the mentors are part of that or something like that, because really what it boils down to is the ongoing education of the mentors to be able to guide people. But that also means that they have to actually put effort into that and be aware so they can make those recommendations and tie that information back.
Question up front here.
As the mic is coming, don't underestimate your ability to lead the change. Okay? Don't assume that it has to be someone else. You raising the point will actually engage people.
So thank you, everyone. This is really thought-provoking. I have 2 questions. So purely from DE&I and talent recruitment perspective, the point of intersection, Mignon, you answered my question partially. But I was curious, so we all have been in stages of our life where we apply for jobs, right? So we tick in these boxes. Are you a female, a male, whatever, what is your race? And I've always been curious, what happens with that data? Do you use that data as a part of your DEI strategy to shortlist candidates? So I'll just give you my example. I'm an immigrant, a US citizen now, a brown-skinned lady. I'm highly educated, I have a PhD, I have an MBA, but at the same time, and I'm highly experienced as well. But I've always been curious, every time I applied for a job, I was like, what happens with this data? Is that used to shortlist my candidature as an applicant? And how is that connected with talent recruitment and DE&I? So that was my first question, and I can ask my second question after that.
So within Fresenius, first of all, we do not look at, it's de-identified.
Okay.
In terms of those demographic factors.
Yes.
But what happens, I'm looking at it in retrospect to understand, it's more for me to understand what's happening as it moves through the process, through the life cycle of employees. So it is, and that is one of those DEI processes that your talent acquisition team really owns to ensure that, applicants have a true fair opportunity to interview or move through a cycle for being considered for employment. Now, what happens though, where we see one of those, I call it one of those kind of forks in the road, is internal promotion, where you have that information and the recruiters and the hiring managers know this. So this is where being more innovative in terms of the selection process sort of changes. And we've piloted a couple of things, have not landed on one, but using a team approach for interviews for internal hire and promotion, where you ensure that team is diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, departments, roles, and that becomes a way to mitigate the bias that one will see.
That's helpful, thank you. And my second question was around pay equity. So how advanced do you think the industry in general is for pay equity? And I'm a woman, so I'm speaking from a woman's perspective. And how advanced are your companies from a pay equity and transparency perspective?
So I'll speak for my company. We are very, very young in that journey. In fact, I have a meeting scheduled next week with some of our folks in Germany and our consultants to talk about innovative ways to address that. In full disclosure, in for-profit healthcare organizations that are heavily dependent upon government reimbursement, we are very challenged from a P&L perspective in terms of that, and how do we deliberately and intentionally address this in a manner that supports the business as well. So we're young. I don't know if you guys have any.
I guess I'll throw out there, I think the idea of pay equity and really digging in and getting answers is fairly new just in general. I don't think it's just our field. And it's extensive because it's never as simple as it seems. That's everything DEI related. So for instance, if you're an international company, and this is something we run into, job titles, right? Having to go, so before you even get to the pay equity, having to go back and align job titles, make sure people are in the right place, make sure things are actually the way they're supposed to be before you even do the pay equity. Because when you have companies that grow really fast, people are kind of just doing things. And so you have to go back and correct those things. So I think just in general, it takes sometimes years for people to do a pay equity study. So I think it's just kind of newer in general for a lot of fields.
So similarly at Zimmer Biomet, we have been doing pay equity studies. We do that. We work with external consultants. If we find there's any gap or variation, we fix that and adjust it. And so one of the things I would highlight, I think it's important to understand something about sort of overall pay equity without diving too deeply into the weeds, but there, you see all the things 60 cents on the dollar, 70 cents on the dollar. I think one of the reasons this work becomes important, the data and the insights that we gain from it, as we've talked about, why we set goals for representation and leadership for women, people of color, and have a focus around this, is because some of what you're seeing too is if you're in more senior roles, you're making more money. And so the lack of diversity in those senior roles drives some of that pay equity gap that you're seeing. So that's one element. So when you're doing pay equity work, you actually sort of take out all the noise and you try to get actually role for role when you're looking at individuals to understand, someone with the same experience, are there gaps there? But in reality, what you're hearing about often is we don't have enough women, we don't have enough people of color in those more senior roles making the money that allows us to close that gap. So it's just something just to be mindful of about the actual data you're hearing and digging into it and understanding it. Some parts of the world are, really, really focused about showing both your adjusted and unadjusted pay equity numbers, UK as an example, so that you can see where those gaps are and then understand what companies are doing to try to correct it. So hopefully that's a little helpful. Yeah.
No, I mean, our company does do pay equity analysis and makes adjustments if necessary. And,
absolutely.
But it is a very, it's, consultants doing it. You're looking at where somebody lives. And so it is quite a science, I would say, to it. And a lot of companies are doing it. They're looking at promotion equity as well, looking at the data for that. I think that not as many companies, and at least from, I've been in the medtech industry for a year. I think medtech's maybe not as transparent within where they are. There's usually a line in a report that they do it. I would say that other companies or other industries are maybe ahead of, and then here it is, it's for women, exactly. It's 99.9% or whatever. They'll tell you what the ratio is. So I think for, medtech overall or med device, it's happening and maybe not consistently across the industry, but it's probably not as transparent.
Pharma is ahead of us in this. We both came out of pharma industry is ahead of us as an industry in this. And yet, for both of our organizations, we have processes in place around that. But it is, I think, to Jasmine's point, if you think about industries that are growing fast, acquisitive, all of that's changing those numbers every time you're doing something there. So like you said, you may have different practices as an organization you bought. You have to correct for that over time through the pay process. So it is a science and an art.
And I would just add to that as managers and leaders, you have an opportunity every time you do an annual review or look at salary and bonus. So make sure you're looking at it because you can drive change as well.
Actually, I mean, it's a point I feel like we've all said, but we talked about, the recruitment process, but then Mignon was like, when you hand it off when the recruiter hands it off to the hiring manager, we have a lot of different people here. I can't impress upon you enough, and I believe in it, myself, that personal or individual responsibility to really make change in an organization, you all have that power, right? Yes. So as a hiring manager, as a people leader, as someone leading a project, wherever you're placed as a peer, the things that I talk about with my employees who come to me, they're talking about microaggressions that's why they're leaving, right? Mm-hmm. They're leaving an organization not because the title is slightly not what they want and they can go get it somewhere else. They're leaving because it's not a good environment. Mm-hmm. Their day-to-day isn't good. Of course, yes, everyone wants to get paid fairly. Everyone wants to, have more visibility. I mean, not everyone, but a lot of people want to have more visibility. They want to have good work-life balance or good benefits. But I think that's where you'll see the change, or that's where you see people kind of saying they're done with a company or they're, done with a role is just their day-to-day experience. So
It's culture.
It's something, yeah,
Culture.
yeah.
That makes me think of another part of talent acquisition I think gets overlooked, which is employer brand or your talent brand. Mm-hmm. Because everything you just mentioned doesn't just stop with that person leaving. Yes. It is much wider than that. So everything from, I know that I might look at Glassdoor, right? This is something I do whenever I'm at a new company. I look at Glassdoor and you can see all of the information you need that might not be on the career website. I've noticed some companies don't put a lot of things on a career website, so what do? I go look at Glassdoor. And so now the narrative about what it's like to work here is controlled by the people who left these reviews. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the reviews are scathing, the same thing over and over. I'm not even gonna apply. And you can't really measure who didn't apply because of the talent brand that's there. Mm-hmm. The other half of that is even if I go to Glassdoor and things sound great, one thing I know is that may not be the experience for people like me. So I'm going to ask people like me, what is your experience there? Because the concerns I might have are different. I might see a lot of people saying work-life balance is great, and then I talk to other women and they're like, yeah, but our maternity leave is terrible, and the work-life balance once you have kids is trash. Like, that's completely different. And so I can say for sure I have friends who I've worked at a place, and they're like, hey, I want to work there. And I'm like, I don't think you should. Mm-hmm. And you cannot measure that, but it's the piece that the company has some control over, but they don't have a lot, and they don't pay attention to it. They're just like, oh, it's Glassdoor, people complain there, take it with a grain of salt. True, but the people applying don't always feel that way. You can even see people are liking the comment. Mm-hmm. They're literally making decisions about applying somewhere, even looking at what other people are reporting as pay, which may be wrong, before they apply somewhere. So that kind of takes me to pay transparency too, but that's a different topic.
Any other questions from the audience?
Okay, it's a very good topic. So my question is, how would you measure the real effectiveness of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in any organization?
Oh. Was the end part? I'm sorry?
In any organization.
Any organization, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on what you were looking to achieve. I think that's, it's not like an umbrella, so if you're going in with a strategy about what you're looking to achieve, then you come up with measurements. They don't always seem to align. Like for instance, when I'm looking at employee resource groups, I am taking the population of people who are in them and the population who are not and comparing things like retention, promotions, referrals, things like that. But it depends on what you're trying to achieve and where you have gaps. I think a lot of times people are looking at retention of certain populations, tenure, what's the average tenure of a certain population, and promotions tend to be the three I see a lot.
And what I do is I actually look at our company's sort of engagement surveys, and I have the capacity to take that data and cut it across different demographic groups and understand, is engagement different? And so at Zimmer Biomet, we want to look for and make sure that everybody is having the same experience. And again, we can then, if we see a gap, we can go after that and say, what do we need to do? We use that and find as well that, our team members who are part of employee resource groups, their engagement is higher. And that I found that in many, many companies. So there are ways to kind of get at and understand goals that you're setting, things that you're doing. Is the experience of everyone in the company similar? And if there are differences, well, what do you need to do and understand? So going to an employee resource group to talk with them about why might your experience here be different? So I think you can define those in any way, but again, back to using data, and it is what we all do in this space. There's all the feel-good stuff you hear, but we really do, again, there's the science of the work that we do to understand, are we making progress in an organization?
And engagement is a big measure of that,
Engagements.
and so that's probably really common.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question right there.
A lot of people.
Behind you.
Hi, I asked this question of Dr. Solomon, and I'll ask the same of this group. And it was, how do your efforts for DEI vary on a global scale relative to what you're doing in North America or in the U.S.? I've heard from some people at different times that, if you're in a universal healthcare situation, you really don't have an issue of health equity, right? It's not just about it being available, right, or having it funded. So just wondering what has been your experience as global companies addressing global health equity?
Well, I would just start by challenging that in where you have universal health care, that there's equity. Because there's bias in all the measures and things that have been developed over time because they've not focused on diverse populations. So I think first you have to debunk that assumption, right? Universal health care does not mean everybody gets the same or is treated appropriately. And so that needs to change. I don't have the answer for that. If I did, I wouldn't be here necessarily, but there's work going on now, finally, right? And so start to shine the light on it and we'll get there, so.
I would add at Zimmer Biomet, where I think about that, it's not sort of some of the systemic components I think you're addressing, but, things that we're doing in community through medical missions and working with various doctors around the world, to make sure that our products are actually given and used to people who wouldn't necessarily have access to them. So that's a way, I think, of kind of making sure you're giving access, you're addressing some of those gaps in health equity, but some of the sort of components that are, again, unique to different places around the world. I would say that for us as a global company, we want our DE&I experience to be the same, for it to be understood. So we do inclusion, weeks, inclusion months in Asia, and we do them in EMEA. So we do have focuses that bring it to light in those various parts of the world. And, again, our giving back and focus on philanthropic efforts, I think is a way that we address some of the health equity gaps that we see.
And I would say, and keep in mind, I've been at the company I'm at about 6 months now. So we're newer into the international space, but the two things, it's partially aspirational, the two things that stuck out to me is, one, being very aware of the culture. I think it's a mistake to take just kind of like generic and apply. There's so many nuances about how people, for instance, if you're thinking about interviewing, how people from different cultures talk about themselves I think there's even been research done of like the population of people who consider this to be bragging versus this is just self-promotion. Like your elevator pitch. And some people are like, why are you talking to me? Like those type of different nuances. The other thing though is to consider that if you're in a country or a population that's homogenous, how are you going to talk about diversity? Because what I'm noticing is that people are like, we don't have that issue. We're all the same. They forget that they have immigrants. They forget that they have other forms of diversity. And so just getting people to understand that just because everyone has the same nationality or the same ethnicity or the same race does not mean that you don't need to talk about diversity and inclusion. And that last thing, like we said, is like, what data can I collect legally? What are other ways we can kind of get around those loopholes of finding out what's actually going on without asking, listening sessions with the population there, and just asking directly, because a lot of time HR will tell you, hey, we have a lot of African immigrants who work at this location. So great, I can go there and ask them directly what their experience is without having to tally up information.
We probably have maybe time for one last question, if there is one. Can you stand up or we're out of time?
Are we out of time?
Out of time, okay.
We're being
Ask
yanked.
us after.
30 seconds, I thought we could.
Getting the hook.
Hello everybody, my name is Vamsi. I'm representing Yvonne Medics. We are a small neuroscience medical device company. My question to the panel today would be, as a small company, we have limited resources right now to promote inclusion. I'll also share an experience before the question. When we start the hiring process for the product development team, I am the head of product development. We often receive the question that, do you have any LGBTQ community members already working for you? And we, instead of talking about inclusion, we have to talk about initiation of such inclusions. And how do we get an entry point and really promote this culture that we are open, that we welcome you with great respect to be a part of us, and we treat you with equity in all terms, in all factors. And how do we really promote this, especially to get an entry point into the communities that have this misconception that small startups or companies do not favor such environments?
Anybody have a quick answer?
Yeah, right, there's no quick answers here.
So what I would tell you, I would say, even being a small company versus a large company, I would suggest focus on inclusion, but begin with trust. There are, and I'll give you a resource or a reference. There's a book called Unleashed. It was written by two professors at Harvard University, Francis Fry and Ann Morris, and it is a great roadmap to launching into diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly where you start with inclusion and building trust. And I think if you can create an environment or be able to articulate or model behaviors where the culture is everybody feels safe, welcomed, celebrated, and cherished, it will answer itself.
Great, that works.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been an honor to be here with you all. Thanks.